The question I was asked today and asked to speak about is what exactly are non-dual teachings? And it's a fair question. So my description of what a non-dual teaching is that non-dual teachings are actually probably the only, I might say one of the only, if not the only, times in life that there is a concerted, relentless, repeated pointing to the nature of what we really are. And that pointing tells us that what we are is significantly different to the experience that we generally have of ourselves, and more so, significantly different to everything that is commonly agreed upon in the wider world, commonly agreed upon about what we are. So really, the whole world has agreed that what we are is the body, that each human is basically a body that is separate from anything else, not connected to anything else, and has autonomy, makes choices of its own volition, and is in control of what it does. So that body is what is generally accepted to be the entity which is living its life. And the experience that we have supports that. So the experience that we have by and large is, I am this body, and this body is the source of the aliveness or the consciousness that functions through it. Now, that is if anyone even goes that far as to recognize that there is a consciousness functioning through the body. So I wouldn't be surprised if you went up to someone in the street and said, "Who are you?" The answer is, what a silly question. My name is John, and here I am. And primarily what John would be talking about is, John is the physical object in front of you, and that physical object is able to talk and listen and move, and I go to work and I do this and that, and I have a family and I live in this house and I was born here, and that's who I am. Non-dual teachings basically turn that understanding of who we are upside down. And so that's, in essence, what non-dual teachings are. They are a continuous, unrelenting pointing to what we really are, the essence that functions through the body, the consciousness that functions through the body. So the surface experience is, I am the body. If we inquire deeper, if we go beyond the set of beliefs that have become so ingrained that they become unchallenged, they become treated as truth, often we have no reason to question, who am I? Am I really the body? When we come across non-dual teachings, that's all that non-dual teachings are interested in pointing at. And if the teaching resonates, and if the teaching sinks in to the depth of our being, it becomes more than just a pontification or an opinion, but it becomes something that we can know, not intellectual knowing, but knowing in non-dual teachings, the knowing with a capital K. And it denotes a knowing that is so intimate, a knowing that has no gap between the entity and the knowing. So it's often known as being, where we know because we are. It is self-evident. And so the teachings, in whichever form they come, and there are many different non-dual teachings, are all there to erode the ingrained beliefs that are now covering up the essence of who we are, that is always there, has always been there, and always will be there. So it's the birthright of every human being. Anyone with consciousness, that is anyone who is able to recognize the moment, whatever that moment happens to be, has consciousness. And that consciousness is the essence of what we are. And the body is not the source of that consciousness. The body is just a vehicle through which that consciousness is functioning. The consciousness's source is prior to the body. And once we recognize that there is a consciousness functioning through the body and become still enough to move back to the point where that consciousness starts, that's the point between the source and the body. And it can be called I am. That's the feeling. It's a sense of existence. What exists is not defined, but undoubtedly when there is a resting in I am, there is a knowing I am. And that is the meeting point between the impersonal consciousness and the personal consciousness. And it is really impersonal consciousness functioning through a body, expressing itself as personal consciousness. And once this becomes known firsthand, not as some mental concept, but as the actual place of being, then our connection to Source is known to have always been there, known to always be there. And it's being connected to Source, which the words imply that there are two, me and Source, which is not what we're actually talking about, but words inherently are dualistic. So as long as we can work around the fact that we are using dualistic words, this connection that can exist becomes the source of our peace, the source of our happiness. And when that connection is present and unbroken, circumstance in the flow of life starts to mean a lot less than it used to when we believed ourselves to be this physical body. So circumstance in the flow of life would now be seen as simply pleasure or pain. Its consequence is far less than it was when our sense of worth, our sense of being was dependent on outcomes. And so therefore it's that connection to self, which is self-evident that our being is always complete, that allows us to be at peace in daily living, regardless of the circumstances. Sometimes circumstances will be pleasurable, sometimes they'll be painful. And it's this resting at the point of being that allows the flow of life to happen without creating suffering. So ultimately, non-dual teachings are trying to point to our home, trying to point out the obstacles that are in the way of us just being. And if this happens, the result is continual, unbroken happiness in life, even in the face of death, which is what ultimately we all come to face. So happiness for the human being, in more practical terms, is not some form of enjoyable pleasure, but it's simply the absence of suffering, which takes on many forms: guilt, blame, attachment to outcomes, expectations, pride. The absence of that is peace of mind. And peace of mind is the state in which our connection to Source is felt. Peace of mind is actually what human happiness is. Once this becomes our way of being, then nothing else is sought.